It's a common adage in creative writing circles that a good story should aim to create a sense of satisfying surprise. Think about a book, movie, or show you read or watched that bored you because it was predictable. Now, think about a story that you remember taking your breath away because it took you by surprise. This is not going to be a conversation about plot twists. There is a difference between a plot twist and a story going in an unexpected direction. A plot twist often becomes what the movie is known for. He was dead all along. She was only dreaming. They were actually ghosts the whole time. A story with a satisfying surprise, on the other hand, has a different power to it, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. I want to take the rather broad advice to write a satisfying surprise and see what other people actually do to make it happen. What other writers actually do by way of concrete, actionable advice to engineer satisfying surprise into your story in a way that avoids becoming merely plot twisty. The movie that started this conversation in my head for me was Marvel's Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, directed by Ryan Coogler and written by Coogler and Joe Robert Cole. What struck me about this film was how it delivered such a satisfying viewer experience while also absolutely delivering on the element of surprise. Most viewers just think that they want to have their expectations met by a film, but what they really want is to be taken on a journey. And like a good roller coaster, to execute that takes a willingness to thrill. One thing that Wakanda Forever had working against it, like many franchise installments, was a tidal wave of audience expectations. What that gives us, though, is a petri dish to test how a story actually plays out compared to what an audience expected of it. Wakanda Forever not only faced insurmountable expectations, but a general cultural climate of viewership that has really become notorious for voicing all displeasure over any content that fails to meet expectations, let alone surpass or surprise them. To see this movie pull its storytelling magic tricks on its audience and be received so warmly was really encouraging to see in an era of a lot of mass-produced content creation that strives merely to meet demand and then return on investment rather than tell a great, gripping story. That's why I wanted to look at Wakanda Forever for ideas on how that element of satisfying surprise can work from a writing level. However, just looking at an example of a story with a satisfying surprise isn't really going to be enough to teach us how to do that ourselves. Like the adage itself, it gives us an ideal without actually giving us actionable advice or a precise step to take forward. So for that, we're going to turn to Pixar's internet-famous 22 Rules of Storytelling. The original list was made famous on Twitter by former Pixar story artist Emma Coates, and it features 22 guidelines for good storytelling used at the studio. There is plenty of coverage out there for you to check out if you want to learn more, but what I like most about Pixar's storytelling rules is that they fill that need for truly actionable advice, something that you can actually do, and not just an adage about what to strive for. The relevant rule for us today is rule number 12, which states the following: discount the first idea that comes to mind, and the second, and the third, and fourth, and fifth. Get the obvious ones out of the way. Surprise yourself. There it is, right in the text. Surprise. When trying to pick apart how Wakanda Forever executed its surprises so skillfully, I realized that some of the story beats in the film felt like what would have been the third or fourth on the list of obvious possible choices, and that is what brought the Pixar rule to mind. Coogler and Cole managed to pull that off at a time when anything other than the obvious choice can literally leave fans infuriated. One of the film's producers, Nate Moore, spoke directly to their awareness of fan expectations when approaching this movie. He told the Ringerverse podcast that, as filmmakers and storytellers, you have to figure out how people are going to feel going into your movie and what you want that movie to say about the guy who's not going to be in that movie. With all that in mind, let's take Wakanda Forever, a movie that absolutely delivers on satisfying surprises, and break down a story beat using Pixar's 12th rule to demonstrate how you can use alternate drafts of a scene to engineer satisfying surprise into your stories. The story beat we will be looking at is Shuri's arrival in the ancestral plane after recreating the heart-shaped herb, a scene I think you'll agree offered up one of the most satisfying surprises in all of Marvel's Phase 4. First, some context, and from this point on, there will be spoilers. This whole film, Shuri has been grappling with the grief of losing her brother, while the film itself grapples with the grief of losing the franchise's lead actor. For the duration of the film, her mother has been guiding her toward peace and acceptance. Then, Talokan attacks. In the aftermath, Shuri loses her mother, and in her words, the last person who truly knew her. She is lost, bitter. After her mother's funeral, Shuri succeeds in recreating the heart-shaped herb. She takes it and goes under. She emerges from the water and arrives in the ancestral plane. We read in the screenplay, Shuri climbs out of the water, breathes deep, and looks around. Across the room, the throne is facing the window. She walks around to see who is seated there. That's when she sees the throne of Wakanda from behind, where someone is clearly sitting, but she can't yet see who. It's here that you can feel the possibilities at work, the setup for the surprise. It's this moment that you can feel the writers sorting through the options to deliver the most satisfying story, because it's here that you can feel the audience asking, what's going to happen next? Which is exactly where you want your audience to be. Shuri rounds the throne to reveal that sitting upon it is... Well, now let's think about who it could be. The obvious choice we were all expecting was Ramonda, who we just lost mere scenes beforehand. In fact, the movie seems to acknowledge and lean into that expectation of ours. Before we see who is in the chair, all we can see is parts of their clothes, and the way they are sitting, the clothes that they're wearing looks like just the sort of thing Ramonda would be wearing. It goes without saying in the film that Ramonda is the expected answer, but the screenplay actually goes one step further toward confirming this. Though not included in the final film, one version of the screenplay actually has Shuri voice her curiosity out loud, calling out for her mother as she makes her way around the throne. This is the fun part of the process of writing the satisfying surprise. This is where you realize that if the answer to the question of what happens next is your first choice, given all the story that has happened so far, then that's likely what a lot of the audience will be expecting as well. You can then use that as this movie has, by hinting to the audience that their first expectation is correct without truly confirming it, and then you hand them the idea you've actually arrived at, and you do it in a way that elevates the story. Because despite all the hope we might have to see Shuri reunited with her mentoring mother in her most desperate hour of need, Ramonda is not the one sitting in the chair. Let's see, what else might the audience be expecting? Well, I'll tell you one thing. A lot of people wondered if Marvel would do the unthinkable and recast the role of T'Challa. In an interview with Total Film, producer Nate Moore responded to this possibility, saying, quote, "I could not imagine turning to the best young actor in the world who wasn't Chadwick and being like, okay, so you're T'Challa. I could not and cannot imagine that." Some were fearful that Marvel might even pull a computer-generated resurrection, something that, along with de-aging technology, Disney has been no stranger to with both Marvel and Star Wars. Kevin Feige assured fans in an interview with Deadline, quote, "We're not going to have a CG Chadwick, and we're not recasting T'Challa." Here was a moment when fan expectations were brought right to the surface. They expected Marvel to bring T'Challa back somewhere, and this scene could have been the perfect place to do it. To be fair, this is a very high-profile problem to have. Not a level of fan expectation that most writers will have to deal with, but it still presents us with an occasion where the second option was struck from that list. And thankfully so, Shuri does not see T'Challa seated in that throne. The films have shown other members in the ancestral plane already, namely her father and her uncle. Her father T'Chaka is who T'Challa saw in the ancestral plane, and he would have been a perfectly acceptable answer to the question of who is sitting on the throne, especially in the immediate wake of Ramonda's death. By this point, the film has passed through so much grief, wandered through so much loss, that at this moment, we expect, even want, Shuri, as well as ourselves, to experience the relief of the sight of a familiar face, the offering of comforting words. But no, T'Chaka is also not in the chair. Sitting at the Wakandan throne in the ancestral plane, Awaiting Shuri's arrival in her deepest hour of grief is Eric Killmonger, a more surprising reveal than anything this film had to say or show about who would next take on the mantle of the Black Panther. We wanted consolation. We expected a close family member. We got the villain from the previous film, Shuri's cousin, and it's great. If you or I were sat down in a writer's room and asked the question, who does Shuri see in the ancestral plane? If we're being honest with ourselves, I don't think Killmonger would have been first or even second on most people's lists. Perhaps not even third. So when you're writing, you need to find places in your story to do as Pixar's rule says and surprise yourself. Write that list of possible answers, as we can imagine the writers at Marvel sitting down to do here. This is a great exercise, especially at moments in your story that you yourself don't have completely figured out yet. There's no better place to surprise yourself. But of course, that's only half of the battle. The surprise still has to work. It still has to make sense. It still has to satisfy an audience. Killmonger showing up in the throne works because it plays right into Shuri's journey as a character. Her journey explores what we do about our grief. At the moment in the film when she enters the ancestral plane, she is not in any place of peace about that grief. She is angry. She has been the entire film. Namor has hammered her, pressured her with the most difficult of choices to make, and then he took Shuri's mother from her in an act of wanton violence and destruction. In her heart of hearts, Shuri wants retribution, so the ancestral plane gives her the family member best suited to speak to that. Furthermore, the very circumstances under which Shuri enters the ancestral plane in the first place set her up for this moment, a moment she views as failure. She enters from a place of doubt, unsure what to expect at all. She has spent much of the film renouncing Wakandan tradition, doubting the spirituality that her people share. Before the film even begins, during the black screen right before the film reveals its first shot, the first thing we hear is Shuri bargaining, praying, swearing that she will never doubt again as long as her brother's life can be saved. Throughout the film, Shuri actually rejects Ramonda's traditional views on grieving, on the afterlife. Fittingly, it is thus not Ramonda that we see in the ancestral plane, no matter how badly Shuri wants to, no matter how badly we want to. Instead, we see someone else from the franchise who shares Shuri's disdain for Wakandan tradition. And instead of offering Shuri encouragement and wisdom for finding peace ahead, he only goads her further down the dark path to retribution she is already on, pushing her further down the wrong way on her journey, closer to destruction, forcing her to contend with the consequences of her choices when the battle is at its most dire, forcing her to learn that lesson of her story not at the more comfortable moment at the ancestral plane, but later on the brink of her nation's defeat, having been led there by her own heedless decision to pursue vengeance. Meeting Killmonger in the ancestral plane is not the choice I think a lot of us expected or would have chosen to write ourselves given the chance, but it sure was the right one. Of course, any of the other options we went through could have been made to work. I can imagine a version of this film in which Ramonda does appear in the ancestral throne, in which Ramonda does appear to Shuri, reiterating the lessons she has beseeched Shuri to learn since the beginning. I can imagine a version of this film where Ramonda appears to Shuri, and Shuri rejects her advice again anyways, remaining on the path to vengeance and to destruction. In this version of the film, things could have actually been remarkably similar from this moment of the film to the very end. But would the moment have struck so deep? No one can say, but I'm willing to wager it wouldn't. Surprise yourself. Take an inflection point in your story, where a character faces a fork in the road, where you, the writer, face a fork in the road, and take the 12th page out of Pixar's book. Make your list of what happens next. Keep going until you discover the option that makes you lean forward, that amps up the stakes in a way that the other options don't. Because if you can surprise yourself, the writer who has the world of the story in your head from the God's eye view, imagine the impact that will have on your readers and watchers, as long as you make it satisfying.